Still driving that rusty Honda that embarrasses my family, my ex-wife shouted. Get a real car or don't come around. I quietly drove away. She followed me home and froze when she saw my garage. Because inside were. I should have known this Tuesday was going to be a disaster the moment I saw Camille's BMW already parked in the Branston Prep Academy lot. There she was, leaning against her pearl-white luxury machine like some kind of suburban queen holding court with the other perfectly coiffed moms who probably spent more on their weekly manicures than most people made in a month. But hey, I wasn't here for drama. I was just dropping off Emma's science project, the volcano she'd been working on for weeks, complete with baking soda eruption and a presentation board that looked like something straight out of NASA. The October air had that crisp bite to it that made you grateful for a decent jacket, and I pulled my old leather one a little tighter as I grabbed the project from my back seat. My 2014 Honda Civic might not have been the flashiest ride in this particular parking lot. Hell, it probably cost less than the monthly payment on half the vehicles here, but it got me from point A to point B without breaking down or breaking the bank. The thing was reliable as a Swiss watch and had never given me a single problem in all the years I'd owned it. Sure, it wasn't going to turn heads or impress anyone at the country club, but that wasn't exactly high on my priority list these days. I was halfway across the asphalt when Camille's voice cut through the afternoon air like a knife through butter, loud enough to make every conversation in a 50-foot radius screech to a halt. Still driving that rusty Honda that embarrasses our family? Get a real car or don't come around. The words hit me like a slap across the face, and I could feel every single pair of eyes in that parking lot swivel in my direction. Great. Just fantastic. Leave it to my ex-wife to turn a simple school drop-off into a public spectacle that would probably be gossip fodder for the next 3 PTA meetings. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned to look at her, really look at her, standing there with her arms crossed and that familiar expression of disgust painted across her face. The same look she used to give me when I'd suggest we skip the expensive restaurant and just order pizza instead, or when I'd wear jeans to one of her work parties instead of dropping $500 on some designer suit I'd wear exactly once. Camille had always been about appearances, about making sure everyone knew exactly how successful and important she was, and apparently divorce hadn't changed that one bit. Then I glanced back at my Civic, really examining it with fresh eyes. Rust-free? Check. The silver paint was still gleaming from the wash I'd given it just 3 days ago. Clean interior? Absolutely. I'd vacuumed it out and wiped down all the surfaces just last weekend. Perfect mechanical condition? You bet your ass it was. I'd had it serviced at my regular shop just 2 months ago, and they'd given it a clean bill of health. The thing ran like a dream and would probably outlast half the overpriced European imports scattered around this lot. But I could see exactly what Camille saw when she looked at it. A symbol of everything she thought was wrong with me. Everything she believed I wasn't ambitious enough to change. The smart play would have been to argue, to point out that my car was in pristine condition and that there wasn't a damn thing wrong with driving something practical and reliable. I could have reminded her that not everyone needed to finance their self-worth through their monthly car payment, or that some of us had different priorities than impressing a bunch of people we barely knew. Hell, I could have asked her why she felt the need to humiliate me in front of half the school's parent population over something as trivial as my choice of transportation. But I didn't do any of that. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Camille was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. Messy, frustrating, and ultimately pointless. She'd made up her mind about me years ago, decided I was some kind of failure who'd never amount to anything significant, and no amount of logic or reason was going to change that fundamental belief. So instead of giving her the satisfaction of a reaction, instead of playing into the drama she was so obviously trying to create, I simply nodded. Just a small acknowledgement that I'd heard her loud and clear. The whispers started immediately. I could hear fragments of conversations bubbling up around me. Did you hear what she said to him? And that poor man, how embarrassing, and I can't believe she made such a scene. The other parents were eating this up like it was better than cable television, and I could practically feel their eyes boring into my back as I turned away from the confrontation and walked back toward my car. I opened the driver's door with as much dignity as I could muster and slid behind the wheel, my hands finding their familiar places on the steering wheel. The engine started up immediately, because of course it did, it always did, and I put the car in reverse. As I backed out of my parking space, I caught a glimpse of Camille in my rearview mirror. She was still standing there with her arms crossed, probably savoring her little victory, completely satisfied that she'd put me in my place in front of all the right people. What I didn't realize as I pulled out of that parking lot, what couldn't have occurred to me in a million years, was that Camille wasn't done with her performance. She wasn't content to just humiliate me and call it a day. No, apparently she had decided to follow me home, probably thinking she could squeeze a little more satisfaction out of whatever lesson she thought she was teaching me. Little did she know, she was about to get an education of her own. The moment I pulled out of Branston Prep's parking lot, I made a split-second decision that would change everything. Instead of taking my usual route home down the main drag with all its traffic lights and strip malls, I hung a left onto Maple Street and started winding my way through the back roads of Branston Hills. These narrow, tree-lined streets were my secret weapon against rush-hour traffic, but today they served a different purpose entirely. I needed time to decompress, time to let the bitter taste of humiliation wash out of my mouth before I got home, and had to pretend like nothing had happened. The autumn leaves were putting on quite a show, painting the whole neighborhood in shades of amber and crimson that would have been Instagram-worthy if I gave a damn about that kind of thing. But right now, all that natural beauty felt wasted on me. My chest was tight with that familiar cocktail of anger and disappointment that Camille had always been so good at mixing up for me. Even after 2 years of divorce, even after all the therapy sessions and self-help books and well-meaning advice from friends, she still had this uncanny ability to make me feel like I was 12 years old again, getting picked last for dodgeball. That's when I caught sight of her in my rearview mirror. The pearl-white BMW was staying exactly 3 car lengths behind me, matching my speed perfectly as I navigated the winding residential streets. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence. Maybe she just happened to live in this direction. Or maybe she was headed to one of her fancy friends' houses for another one of those wine and gossip sessions she was always attending. But as I made a series of random turns, left on Oak, right on Birchwood, another left on Sycamore, that BMW stayed glued to my tail like we were in some kind of slow-motion car chase. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Camille was actually following me. This wasn't just about the parking lot scene anymore. This was her taking it to the next level, probably thinking she was going to teach me some kind of lesson about knowing my place in the world. I could almost picture her behind the wheel of that BMW, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the leather steering wheel, her lips set in that thin line of determination I knew so well from our marriage. She was probably feeling pretty damn satisfied with herself right about now, probably thinking she had me right where she wanted me. The thing that really got under my skin wasn't just that she was following me. It was what that BMW represented to her, what she thought it said about who she was versus who I was. To Camille, that car wasn't just transportation. It was a statement piece, a rolling billboard advertising her success and sophistication to anyone who cared to look. The monthly payment on that thing was probably more than most people's rent, but that was exactly the point. It screamed status and wealth and everything she thought mattered in life. Meanwhile, here I was in my humble Honda Civic, the car she'd just publicly declared an embarrassment to our family. In her mind, my choice of vehicle was proof positive that I lacked ambition, that I was content to settle for mediocrity while she reached for the stars. She couldn't see past the sticker price to understand that maybe, just maybe, some of us had different priorities than impressing random strangers at traffic lights. I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as I thought about all the times during our marriage when she'd made similar comments. The snide remarks about my clothes, my job, my friends, my hobbies, always delivered with that particular brand of passive-aggressive cruelty she'd perfected over the years. Nothing was ever direct enough to be called outright mean, but it all added up to the same message. I wasn't good enough. I wasn't trying hard enough. I wasn't the man she thought she'd married. The irony was almost laughable. Here she was, following me in her status symbol, probably thinking she was demonstrating her superiority, completely oblivious to what was waiting for her at the end of this little journey. She had no idea that she was about to get the shock of her perfectly organized, appearance-obsessed life. All those years of dismissing me, of treating me like some kind of underachiever who couldn't keep up with her standards, and she was about to discover just how wrong she'd been. I took another turn, this time onto Elmwood Drive, and watched as her BMW dutifully followed suit. The houses in this neighborhood were getting a little smaller, a little more modest, which probably just reinforced whatever narrative she'd constructed in her head about my supposed decline since our divorce. She was probably already planning her next cutting remark, already composing the story she'd tell her friends about poor, pathetic me and my little Honda and my obviously diminished circumstances. But that's the thing about assumptions. They have a funny way of biting you in the ass when you least expect it. Camille thought she knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, thought she had me all figured out based on the car I drove and the image I projected to the world. She was about to learn that sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones people don't bother to tell, and that maybe, just maybe, there was more to her ex-husband than met the eye. When I finally turned into my driveway on Cedar Lane in Midvale, I wasn't surprised to see Camille's BMW pull right up behind me like she owned the place. The woman had some serious balls, I'll give her that much. Following me home was a whole new level of petty, even for her. But apparently, she wasn't done making her point about what a disappointment I was. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, watching in my side mirror as she climbed out of her car with all the grace and authority of someone who thought they were about to deliver the final blow in whatever twisted game she was playing. My house sat there looking exactly like what it was, a clean, well-maintained two-story colonial that wouldn't win any architectural awards but didn't need to apologize for existing either. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the driveway was free of oil stains, and the white paint job was only a couple years old. It was the kind of house that said solid middle class, without screaming it from the rooftops, the kind of place where normal people lived normal lives without feeling the need to put on a show for the neighbors. But I could already see the wheels turning in Camille's head as she took in the modest facade. This wasn't the sprawling mansion she'd probably been expecting, wasn't the kind of trophy property that would signal I'd somehow managed to claw my way up the social ladder since our divorce. No circular driveway, no fancy landscaping, no three-car garage that could house a collection of expensive toys. Just a regular house in a regular neighborhood where people actually knew their neighbors' names and borrowed each other's lawnmowers. She stepped out of her BMW wearing those ridiculously high heels that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, the kind of shoes that were designed more for making statements than for actual walking. Her outfit was classic Camille, perfectly coordinated, obviously expensive, and calculated to make everyone around her feel underdressed by comparison. She crossed her arms and surveyed my property like she was some kind of real estate appraiser, and I could practically see the disappointment radiating off her in waves. "This is where you live now." The words came out dripping with that particular brand of disdain she'd perfected during our marriage, the tone that suggested she'd just discovered something vaguely unsanitary on the bottom of her shoe. Her voice carried that artificial sweetness that barely concealed the venom underneath, the same voice she'd used when she wanted to cut me down to size without technically being called cruel. I took my time getting out of the Honda, refusing to be rushed by her obvious impatience. Let her stand there in her designer heels and judge my house, my car, my life choices. Let her think she'd figured out the whole story based on what she could see from the curb. The woman had always been quick to jump to conclusions, always ready to write people off based on surface-level observations, and today was going to be no different. What really got to me wasn't just the judgment in her voice, it was the assumption behind it. She thought she had me all figured out, thought my modest house was proof that I'd settled for mediocrity while she'd moved on to bigger and better things. In her mind, this unremarkable colonial was evidence that our divorce had been the right call, that she'd been smart to cut loose from someone who clearly lacked the ambition to achieve anything significant. I could see her mentally comparing my place to whatever fancy setup she was living in now, probably some overpriced condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who called her Ms. Camille and pretended to care about her day. She was probably already planning how she'd describe this scene to her friends, how she'd paint the picture of her poor, pathetic ex-husband living in suburban mediocrity while she soared to new heights of success and sophistication. But here's the thing about Camille that hadn't changed in all the years I'd known her. She never could see past the surface of anything. She'd look at a book and judge it entirely by its cover, never bothering to crack it open and see what was actually written inside. She'd meet someone and decide their entire worth based on their job title or their zip code or the brand of watch they wore, never taking the time to discover who they really were underneath all the external trappings. Standing there in my driveway, looking at her look at my house with such obvious disdain, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of years of her constant criticism, or maybe it was just the sheer audacity of her following me home to continue her little performance. Whatever it was, I decided right then and there that I was done letting her control the narrative. I said nothing in response to her question about where I lived. Instead, I walked past her toward my garage with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing something the other person doesn't. "You followed me," I said, my voice steady and matter of fact. "You might as well see the rest." The garage door remote felt surprisingly light in my hand as I pulled it from my pocket, but the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This was it. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for since the day Camille walked out of our marriage, convinced she was trading up from a man who'd never amount to anything special. All those months of her subtle digs and not-so-subtle hints about my lack of ambition were about to come full circle in the most spectacular way possible. I pressed the button with deliberate slowness, savoring every second as the mechanical hum of the garage door opener kicked into gear. The sound echoed through the quiet suburban afternoon like a drum roll before the main event, and I could feel Camille's eyes boring into my back as she waited to see what new disappointment my garage might reveal. She was probably expecting to find the usual suburban dad collection, maybe some rusted lawn equipment, a few cardboard boxes full of Christmas decorations, perhaps a workbench covered in dust and good intentions. The door rose inch by agonizing inch, revealing first the polished concrete floor that gleamed like a mirror under the carefully installed LED lighting system. Even that small detail would have been lost on most people, but I'd spent weeks researching the best epoxy coating to ensure the floor looked absolutely pristine. As more of the garage came into view, I heard Camille take a sharp intake of breath behind me, and I couldn't help but smile just a little. The lights kicked on automatically as the door reached its halfway point, triggered by sensors I'd installed to create exactly this kind of dramatic effect. What those lights illuminated was a sight that would have made any car enthusiast weep with joy. A collection that represented years of careful planning and strategic purchasing, each vehicle chosen not just for its performance, but for the statement it made about precision, excellence, and uncompromising standards. The charcoal gray Lamborghini Huracan EVO sat closest to us, its angular lines and aggressive stance making it look like it was ready to pounce, even while standing perfectly still. The carbon fiber accents caught the light and threw it back in sharp, geometric patterns that seemed to dance across the garage walls. This wasn't just a car. It was a work of art, a testament to Italian engineering and design that could go from 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds and make every moment of that acceleration feel like pure poetry. Next to the Lumbo, the deep blue McLaren 720S looked like something that had just rolled off the set of a science fiction movie. The butterfly doors were closed, but even at rest the car radiated an otherworldly presence that suggested it belonged more on a racetrack than in some suburban garage. The British engineering that went into every curve and angle of that machine represented the absolute pinnacle of automotive technology, the kind of innovation that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. And then there was the Ferrari 488 GTB, classic black with just enough chrome detailing to catch the eye without being flashy about it. If the Lamborghini was poetry and the McLaren was science fiction, then the Ferrari was pure Italian passion made manifest in steel and carbon fiber. Every line of that car sang with the kind of heritage and tradition that couldn't be bought or faked, the legacy of decades spent perfecting the art of making machines that could touch the very edge of human possibility. All three vehicles sat on the spotless garage floor like sleeping predators, their paint jobs so perfect they seemed to glow from within. Not a speck of dust, not a fingerprint, not even a water spot marred their flawless surfaces. These weren't garage queens that got trailered to car shows for rich guys to brag about. These were precision instruments that had been purchased to be driven, maintained to exacting standards, and cared for with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that separated true enthusiasts from mere collectors. The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. I could practically hear the gears grinding in Camille's head as she tried to process what she was seeing, tried to reconcile the modest house and reliable Honda with this garage full of automotive excellence that probably cost more than most people's homes. Her mouth had fallen open in a way that would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so loaded with years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. "What is this?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper, her usual confidence completely shattered by the cognitive dissonance of seeing something that simply didn't fit into the neat little box she'd constructed around who I was supposed to be. The woman who'd spent years telling me I lacked ambition, who'd made me feel like I was settling for mediocrity while she reached for the stars, was suddenly face to face with evidence that maybe, just maybe, she didn't know me as well as she thought she did. I let the question hang in the air for a moment, enjoying the way her certainty had crumbled in the face of reality. After years of being dismissed and underestimated, after countless conversations where she'd made me feel like my dreams were too small and my accomplishments too insignificant, this moment felt like vindication wrapped in Italian leather and German engineering. I took my sweet time answering her question, letting the weight of the moment settle between us like dust after an explosion. Camille stood there in her designer heels, her mouth still hanging open, trying to process the fact that her supposedly mediocre ex-husband had just revealed a garage full of supercars that cost more than most people made in 5 years. The look on her face was priceless, complete and utter bewilderment mixed with the dawning realization that maybe she didn't know jack shit about who I really was or what I was capable of. "I kept the Honda for daily driving," I said finally, my voice as casual as if we were discussing the weather instead of a collection of automotive masterpieces that would make most car enthusiasts sell their firstborn children. "But these are for weekends." I gestured toward the lineup like it was the most natural thing in the world, like every suburban dad had a Lamborghini tucked away next to his lawn mower and Christmas decorations. Camille blinked several times, her brain clearly struggling to catch up with what her eyes were telling her. "How?" The word came out strangled, like she was having trouble getting enough air into her lungs. "You work IT at a school, don't you?" There was something almost desperate in her voice, like she was clinging to the last shreds of the narrative she'd built around my supposed failure to launch. That's when I shook my head and felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "That's what I let people think." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with years of careful misdirection and strategic understatement. All those times during our marriage when she dismissed my work as boring tech stuff, when she'd rolled her eyes at my late nights and weekend coding sessions, when she'd complained that I was more interested in computers than in climbing the social ladder. Turns out she'd been missing the bigger picture entirely. Without saying another word, I walked past her toward the door that connected the garage to the house, knowing she'd follow me like a moth drawn to a flame. The woman who'd spent years telling me I lacked vision and ambition was about to get a crash course in just how wrong she'd been about everything. I led her through the mudroom and down the hallway to what she probably assumed was just another boring home office, the kind of space where suburban dads pretended to work on their fantasy football lineups while their wives rolled their eyes upstairs. But when I flicked on the lights and stepped aside to let her see inside, the sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some half-assed man cave with a desktop computer and a motivational poster. This was a command center that would have made NASA jealous, a high-tech nerve center that looked like something straight out of a cyberpunk movie. 8 massive 34-inch monitors dominated the far wall, arranged in a configuration that gave me complete visibility into every aspect of my business operations. The screens were currently displaying a dizzying array of dashboards, code repositories, system diagnostics, and real-time analytics that painted a picture of a thriving enterprise operating at scales most people couldn't even imagine. Each monitor showed a different slice of the empire I'd built from scratch, the digital kingdom that had been growing quietly in the background while everyone assumed I was just another IT guy fixing printers and resetting passwords. Beneath the monitors, a rack of enterprise-grade servers hummed quietly behind climate-controlled glass, their blinking LED indicators creating a light show that spoke of serious computational power. These weren't the kind of machines you picked up at Best Buy. They were the industrial-strength backbone of an operation that handled millions of transactions and processed terabytes of data every single day. The cooling system alone had cost more than most people's cars. But when you're dealing with the kind of sensitive information and mission-critical applications that kept hospitals running and government agencies secure, you didn't cut corners on infrastructure. My desk was a masterpiece of ergonomic design and cutting-edge technology, a sleek black surface that seemed to float in space while housing enough processing power to launch a space shuttle. The mechanical keyboard felt substantial under my fingers. Each key precisely waited for the kind of marathon coding sessions that had built this empire one line of code at a time. Triple monitors provided additional workspace for development tasks. Their 4K displays showing code editors, terminal windows, and design mock-ups with crystal clarity that made long hours of detailed work not just possible, but actually enjoyable. "I own CodeSpring Innovations, Camille," I said, watching her face carefully as the words sank in. Her eyes were darting from screen to screen, trying to make sense of the technical displays and failing to comprehend the scope of what she was seeing. "We build cybersecurity systems and AI infrastructure for hospitals, schools, and a few agencies I'm not even allowed to name." That last part was delivered with just enough mysterious weight to let her imagination fill in the blanks, and judging by the way her eyes widened, her imagination was running wild with possibilities. The woman who'd spent years treating me like an underachiever was finally starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, she'd been playing checkers while I was playing chess. I could see Camille's eyes moving frantically across the monitors, trying to process the technical displays that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics for all the sense they made to her. The woman who'd always prided herself on being sharp, on knowing exactly where she stood in any situation, was suddenly drowning in a sea of information that was completely outside her wheelhouse. But there was one monitor that didn't require a computer science degree to understand, one screen that spoke a language she was fluent in: cold, hard numbers. My main dashboard was displaying the kind of real-time business metrics that would make any MBA weep with envy, and I could see the exact moment when her brain locked onto the figures that mattered most to someone like her. The numbers were right there in bold, unmistakable font, updating in real time as transactions flowed through our systems and contracts generated revenue streams that most small countries would kill for. She started reading them out loud without even realizing she was doing it, her voice getting smaller and more stunned with each figure that passed her lips. Annual revenue, $76.2 million. The words came out like she was trying to convince herself they were real, like saying them aloud might somehow make the impossible numbers make sense. I watched her face as the magnitude of that figure sank in, watched her mental calculator trying to work out what that meant in terms of everything she thought she knew about me. Active clients, 312. Her voice was barely above a whisper now, and I could see her trying to wrap her head around the idea that I was simultaneously managing relationships with over 300 different organizations, each one paying premium rates for the kind of specialized services that kept their most critical systems running smoothly. These weren't small mom-and-pop shops paying a few $100 a month for basic IT support. These were major institutions, Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and healthcare systems that couldn't afford to have their networks go down for even a few minutes. Q4 profit margin, 47%. That number hit her like a physical blow, and I could see her doing the math in her head, trying to calculate what 47% of $76 million actually looked like in practical terms. For someone who'd spent our entire marriage complaining that I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't driven enough to achieve real financial success, those numbers represented a level of profitability that most businesses could only dream of achieving. But it was the final figure that really knocked the wind out of her sails, the number that transformed her from skeptical to completely speechless. Net assets, $91 million. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fired gun, and I watched as every assumption she'd ever made about my capabilities, my ambitions, and my potential crumbled into dust right in front of my eyes. "You're joking." The words came out flat and lifeless, like she was too stunned to put any real emotion behind them. But I could see in her eyes that she knew I wasn't joking, knew that these numbers were as real as the supercars sitting in my garage, as tangible as the high-tech command center surrounding us on all sides. This wasn't some elaborate prank or carefully constructed fantasy. This was the cold, hard reality of what I'd built while she was busy dismissing me as a failure. I didn't say anything in response to her accusation of joking. Instead, I opened one of my desk drawers with deliberate slowness and pulled out something that would serve as undeniable proof of everything she was struggling to accept. The award was heavy in my hands, a crystal and metal monument to achievement that caught the light from the monitors and threw it back in prismatic patterns across the office walls. National Cybersecurity Summit, I said, handing her the award so she could read the inscription herself. Outstanding Innovation in Enterprise Security Solutions. The weight of it seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected it to be some cheap plastic trophy you could order online. But this was the real deal, the kind of recognition that came from peers who understood exactly how difficult it was to achieve the kind of breakthrough innovations that had made CodeSpring a household name in cybersecurity circles. Her hands were actually shaking as she held the award, and I could see her trying to reconcile this tangible proof of success with the mental image she'd carried of me for so many years. But I wasn't done yet. The wall behind my desk was covered with a carefully curated collection of certifications, patents, and partnership agreements that told the story of a company that had grown from a one-man operation in a spare bedroom to a major player in the global technology landscape. I pointed to the framed documents and watched her eyes follow my gesture, taking in the impressive array of credentials and achievements that most people never even knew existed. Stanford, I said, indicating a partnership certificate that represented months of negotiations and technical demonstrations. MIT, I continued, pointing to another frame that held our research collaboration agreement with one of the most prestigious technology institutions in the world. DoD, I said, letting that particular abbreviation sink in for a moment before moving on to the final frame. Even NASA. The space agency's logo looked almost surreal hanging on the wall of a suburban home office. But there it was, proof positive that the work we were doing at CodeSpring was operating at the absolute cutting edge of what was technologically possible. She looked at me like she had never seen me before, and honestly, maybe she hadn't. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a recently fired gun, and I could see in Camille's eyes that she genuinely didn't understand how we'd lived together for 8 years without her having the slightest clue about the empire I was building right under her nose. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked, and there was something almost accusatory in her tone, like somehow this was my fault for not broadcasting my success loudly enough for her to notice. I turned toward her slowly, taking my time to really look at the woman I'd once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. She was still beautiful, still perfectly put together in that calculated way that made everything look effortless, even though I knew she'd probably spend an hour getting ready just to drop off a school project. But there was something different in her expression now, a crack in that armor of supreme confidence she'd always worn like a designer's suit. "Because back then, you only listened to what looked good on paper," I said, and I could see her flinch slightly at the directness of it. But it was true, and we both knew it. During our marriage, Camille had been obsessed with the kind of success that came with obvious status markers, the right job title, the right neighborhood, the right car in the driveway. She wanted a husband who looked successful at dinner parties, someone she could introduce to her friends without having to explain or justify anything. "You never asked about my work," I continued, watching her face carefully for signs that she was actually hearing me this time. "Only how much it made. When I started the company, you said it sounded like a hobby." The memory of that conversation was still sharp after all these years, the dismissive way she'd waved off my excitement about the first major contract I'd landed, the way she'd rolled her eyes when I tried to explain the potential of what I was building. She looked away, and I could see that she remembered too. All those evenings when I'd come home energized about some breakthrough or excited about a new client, only to have her change the subject to something more immediately practical, like mortgage payments or vacation plans. She'd been so focused on the present tense reality of our bank account that she'd completely missed the long-term vision I was working toward. "You were more interested in what your friends' husbands drove," I said, and that one hit home hard enough to make her visibly wince. During the last few years of our marriage, she developed this habit of casually mentioning other couples we knew, always with these little details about their latest purchases or achievements that were clearly meant to highlight what she saw as my own shortcomings. Sarah's husband had just bought a new Porsche. Jennifer's husband had gotten promoted to partner. Michael's husband had surprised her with a weekend in Napa. The subtext was always crystal clear. Why couldn't I be more like them? Why wasn't I ambitious enough to go after the kind of obvious success that would make her look good at the country club? She'd never been interested in understanding what I actually did for work, never bothered to learn about the technical challenges I was solving or the innovative solutions I was developing. All she cared about was whether it translated into the kind of lifestyle she thought she deserved. I could see her processing all of this, connecting the dots between her behavior during our marriage and the revelation she was experiencing now. The woman who'd spent years making me feel like I was settling for mediocrity was finally understanding that maybe the problem hadn't been my lack of ambition. Maybe the problem had been her complete inability to recognize ambition when it didn't come wrapped in the conventional package she expected. I was building something that mattered, I said quietly, gesturing toward the wall of patents and certifications that represented years of sleepless nights and weekend coding sessions. I was developing systems that would protect hospitals from cyber attacks, creating AI tools that would help teachers personalize education for their students, building security protocols that would keep government data safe from foreign adversaries. But all you saw was that I wasn't driving a flashy car or working at some prestigious firm downtown. The irony was almost painful to acknowledge. While she'd been pressuring me to pursue the kind of conventional success that would make her friends jealous, I'd been quietly building something far more significant than any of their husbands had ever accomplished. But because it didn't fit her narrow definition of what success looked like, because it required patience and long-term thinking instead of immediate gratification, she dismissed it as just another one of my impractical obsessions. "You wanted me to be someone else," I said finally, and there was no anger in my voice anymore. Just a kind of tired resignation that came from years of trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. Someone who cared more about appearances than substance. Someone who would prioritize looking successful over actually being successful. That was never going to be me, Camille. Even if I tried to fake it, that was never going to be who I really was. I could see that Camille was still struggling to process everything she'd learned, her mind trying to reconcile the man she thought she'd married with the reality of what I'd actually accomplished during and after our time together. But if she thought the financial success was impressive, she hadn't seen anything yet. The money was just the byproduct, the inevitable result of building something that actually mattered in the world. What I was really proud of, what got me out of bed every morning with genuine excitement, was the impact we were making on real people's lives. I moved to another workstation and pulled up a different dashboard, one that tracked something far more meaningful than profit margins or revenue streams. This monitor displayed the real-time metrics of the CodeSpring Foundation, the nonprofit arm of our company that I'd established once we'd reached the point where we had more money coming in than we knew what to do with. The numbers on this screen told a story that would have made any decent human being feel proud. A narrative of using success as a platform for lifting others up rather than just accumulating more wealth for its own sake. The main display showed our educational impact in stark, undeniable terms. "We've donated $14 million to low-income schools," I said, watching Camille's expression shift from bewilderment to something approaching awe. These weren't token charitable contributions designed to generate tax write-offs or positive PR. This was serious money being invested in communities that had been systematically underfunded for decades, schools where teachers were buying supplies with their own paychecks and students were learning computer science on machines that belonged in a museum. "Built 62 tech labs," I continued, pulling up photos from some of the installations we'd completed in the past year. The images showed sleek, modern computer labs in schools that looked nothing like the institutional green walls and flickering fluorescent lights you'd expect. These were spaces designed to inspire, equipped with the same kind of cutting-edge hardware and software that tech companies use to develop the next generation of world-changing applications. Kids in Detroit and rural Alabama were getting access to the same tools that Silicon Valley startups use to build billion-dollar companies. Each lab represented months of planning and coordination, working with school administrators to understand their specific needs and constraints, training teachers on how to integrate new technology into their existing curricula, and providing ongoing technical support to ensure the equipment kept working long after the installation teams had moved on to the next project. We weren't just dropping off a bunch of computers and calling it charity. We were creating sustainable programs that would impact thousands of students over the course of their educational careers. Sponsored 98 full college scholarships, I said, and this one clearly hit Camille harder than the previous statistics. She knew what college tuition cost these days, knew that we were talking about millions of dollars invested in individual students who might never have had the opportunity to pursue higher education without this kind of intervention. But more than the money, these scholarships represented hope for kids who'd grown up believing that college was something other people's children did, something reserved for families with trust funds and connections. The scholarship program wasn't just about writing checks either. Each recipient was paired with a mentor from our company, someone who could provide guidance on everything from choosing a major to navigating internship opportunities to planning a career in technology. We were investing in these students' entire futures, not just their ability to pay tuition bills. Some of our earliest scholarship recipients were already working at major tech companies, and a few had even started their own businesses with funding and advice from our investment arm. Developed free AI training tools for high schoolers, I added, pulling up the interface for our most ambitious educational project. This wasn't just another coding bootcamp or online tutorial series. This was a comprehensive curriculum that taught students how to build and train artificial intelligence systems using the same frameworks and methodologies that professional developers used in the real world. We'd made it completely free and accessible, with versions available in multiple languages and designed to work on the kinds of basic hardware that most schools could actually afford. The program had already reached over 50,000 students across 43 states, and the results were nothing short of extraordinary. Kids who'd never considered themselves math people were building neural networks and training machine learning models. Students from rural communities where the biggest employer was the local Walmart were developing AI applications that could solve real-world problems in their own neighborhoods. We were democratizing access to the kind of advanced technical education that had traditionally been available only to students at elite universities or expensive private coding academies. All funded through CodeSpring, I said, gesturing toward the live metrics that showed real-time usage statistics from schools across the country. Students were logged into our platforms right now, working through programming exercises, collaborating on group projects, and building the kinds of technical skills that would open doors they never knew existed. I didn't just build wealth, Camille. I built impact. She stared at the displays showing thousands of active users, hundreds of completed projects, and dozens of success stories from students who'd used our programs to launch careers in technology. The woman who'd spent years criticizing my lack of conventional ambition was finally seeing what I'd been working toward all along. Not just personal success, but the kind of systemic change that could break cycles of poverty and create opportunities for kids who deserved better than the circumstances they'd been born into. The silence that followed my explanation about the foundation's impact stretched between us like a taut wire, heavy with years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Camille stood there absorbing everything she'd seen, her designer heels planted firmly on my office floor, while her entire worldview underwent a seismic shift. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to reconcile the man she thought she'd divorced with the reality of what I'd accomplished, not just financially, but in terms of genuine social impact that would outlast both of us. She opened her mouth to say something, probably another question about how she could have been so blind to what was happening right under her nose, when the familiar buzz of my phone cut through the moment like a knife. Under normal circumstances, I would have ignored it. This conversation had been 8 years in the making, and whatever text message had just arrived could wait another few minutes. But something about the timing felt significant, like the universe was preparing to deliver one final twist to an already surreal afternoon. I glanced at the phone screen and felt my heart skip a beat. The message was from Major General Patricia Wyatt, Pentagon, Department of Defense, Advanced Technology Division. Seeing her name pop up on my personal phone was never routine. When the Pentagon reached out directly to the CEO, instead of going through our usual military liaison channels, it meant something big was happening, something that required the kind of discretion and urgency that didn't go through normal bureaucratic processes. Green light confirmed. You're awarded the $52 million defense contract. meeting next Friday to finalize terms. The words seemed to glow on the screen, each character representing months of presentations, security clearances, technical demonstrations, and negotiations that had finally culminated in the kind of contract that would redefine not just CodeSpring's future, but potentially the way the entire military approached training and education in the digital age. This wasn't just another client win or revenue milestone. This was validation at the highest levels of government that what we built represented a genuine breakthrough in adaptive learning technology. The Pentagon didn't hand out $52 million contracts to companies they weren't absolutely certain could deliver results that would directly impact national security and military readiness. They'd put our systems through months of rigorous testing, subjected our algorithms to scenarios that pushed the boundaries of what artificial intelligence could accomplish, and apparently liked what they saw enough to bet serious money on our continued success. Camille's eyes were sharp enough to catch the sender's name, and I watched her face go through another series of rapid transformations as she processed what she was seeing. The Pentagon? The question came out somewhere between a whisper and a gasp, like she was afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow make this latest revelation disappear like a mirage in the desert. Yes, I said, unable to keep a note of pride out of my voice. This was the kind of moment that validated every late night, every weekend spent debugging code, every sacrifice I'd made to build something that mattered more than just making money. We're developing adaptive learning software for defense training. It'll revolutionize how military personnel learn new tech systems. The implications of what I was describing were staggering, even if Camille couldn't fully grasp the technical complexity involved. Traditional military training relied on standardized curricula that assumed every soldier learned at the same pace and in the same way, leading to inefficiencies that could literally be matters of life and death in combat situations. Our AI system could analyze how individual service members processed information, identify their strengths and weaknesses in real time, and automatically adjust the training experience to optimize learning outcomes for each person. Imagine a young soldier trying to master a complex weapons system or a sophisticated communications protocol. Instead of struggling through a one-size-fits-all training program that might not match their learning style, our software would recognize within minutes whether they were a visual learner who needed diagrams and animations, an auditory learner who responded better to verbal explanations, or a kinesthetic learner who needed hands-on practice to retain information. The system would then automatically reconfigure the entire training experience to play to their individual strengths while strengthening their weaker areas. The potential applications were virtually limitless. Pilots learning to operate new aircraft, cyber warfare specialists mastering defensive protocols, logistics coordinators optimizing supply chain management. Every aspect of military training could be enhanced by AI that understood not just what needed to be taught, but the most effective way to teach it to each individual learner. We were talking about technology that could reduce training times by 30 to 40% while simultaneously improving retention rates and overall competency levels. But the real breakthrough wasn't just in the personalization. It was in the system's ability to continuously learn and improve from every interaction. Each training session generated data that made the AI smarter, more effective at recognizing patterns and predicting optimal learning paths. The software that trained soldiers in Fort Bragg would be informed by lessons learned from training sessions in San Diego, creating a constantly evolving knowledge base that got better at its job with every passing day. The military applications were obvious, but the broader implications for education were what really excited me. The same technology that could help a Marine master battlefield communications could help a struggling third grader understand fractions or assist a community college student working toward a nursing degree. We were building tools that could democratize access to truly personalized education, making the kind of one-on-one tutoring that wealthy families took for granted available to anyone with access to a computer and an internet connection. Camille just stood there, stunned into silence by the magnitude of what she was learning about the man she'd thought she knew so well. The Pentagon contract wasn't just about the money, though $52 million was certainly nothing to sneeze at. It was about recognition at the highest levels that CodeSpring had developed something genuinely revolutionary. something that could change how human beings learn and grow and develop their capabilities throughout their lives. I could see her trying to process not just the financial implications of what she'd discovered, but the broader picture of who I'd become since our divorce. This wasn't the underachieving husband she remembered, the man she'd constantly pushed to be more ambitious and status-conscious. This was someone who'd built an empire while she wasn't paying attention, someone who'd found a way to combine enormous financial success with genuine social impact, someone who'd earned recognition from institutions like Stanford and MIT, and now the Pentagon itself. The woman who'd mocked my Honda Civic in a prep school parking lot was finally beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, she'd been looking at success through the wrong lens entirely. Maybe the most impressive achievements weren't always the ones that came with obvious status symbols. Maybe the most important work happened quietly, behind the scenes, building foundations that would support something much bigger than any individual ego or public recognition. She took a deep breath and looked around my office one more time, taking in the monitors displaying real-time impact metrics, the wall of awards and certifications, the servers humming quietly in their climate-controlled cabinet. "I had no idea," she said finally, and for the first time since she'd shouted at me in that parking lot, her voice carried no trace of condescension or judgment, just amazement, and maybe the beginnings of something that might eventually become respect. As we walked back out to the garage together, the atmosphere between us had shifted completely from the tension and humiliation of that parking lot confrontation just an hour earlier. Camille moved differently now, her designer heels clicking against the concrete with less certainty, less of that aggressive confidence she'd worn like armor when she'd followed me home. The woman who'd been so sure of my limitations was now seeing me through entirely new eyes, and I could tell she was still struggling to process the full scope of what she'd discovered. She stopped in the middle of the garage, surrounded by the Lamborghini, McLaren, and Ferrari that had shattered her assumptions about who I was and what I'd accomplished. Then she turned to face me, and for the first time since our divorce, I saw something in her expression that looked almost like vulnerability. "I mocked you," she said, her voice quiet and carrying a weight I'd never heard from her before. In front of everyone. "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between us, and I found myself genuinely surprised by how it felt to hear those words from her. This was the woman who'd spent years making me feel like I wasn't good enough, who dismissed my dreams and criticized my choices, and ultimately walked away convinced she was trading up for something better. And now she was standing in my garage, looking at the evidence of everything she'd missed, offering me the kind of acknowledgement I'd given up expecting years ago. I didn't say anything right away. Instead, I looked at my faithful Honda Civic sitting there next to all that Italian and British engineering excellence, and I couldn't help but smile. "You called it rusty," I said finally, my voice carrying more amusement than bitterness. "But it helped me stay invisible while I built everything you see here. That's the beauty of it." The irony was perfect, really. While she'd been pressuring me to buy flashier cars and chase more obvious status symbols, that humble Civic had been my secret weapon, allowing me to fly under everyone's radar while I quietly constructed an empire that dwarfed anything her status-obsessed friends had ever accomplished. She took a deep breath, and I could see her processing not just what she'd learned about me, but what it meant about her own judgment and priorities. "Will you tell your daughter?" she asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. I nodded. "Eventually. But I want her to know that real success doesn't need to shout." As Camille walked back to her BMW, she turned one last time. "So, what car will you bring next time?" I glanced at the Lamborghini, its angular lines gleaming under the garage lights. "Maybe this one. Or maybe I'll bring the Honda again. Depends on how I feel." As her taillights disappeared down the street, I opened the Ferrari's door and settled into the Italian leather seat. The engine roared to life with a sound that could wake the dead, but I wasn't starting it to prove anything to anyone. Tonight, I drive not to make a statement or impress the neighbors, but simply because I could.